China's global outreach is starting to touch key American interests and maybe hit a little too close to home, like the Panama Canal. And investing in former U.S. economic allies.
I think China has always had interest in our geographical position.
Do you have any concerns?
This week, we travel to South and Central America to see where China is building and why we might want to pay attention.
During the COVID pandemic, billions of tax dollars were spent to research, develop, and manufacture vaccines.
So during the pandemic, I think the American people started to ask the question, just how close is big government to big pharma?
This week, we look into the legal but ethically questionable way scientists working for the government have been profiting from pharmaceutical companies while we pick up the tab. Angela Merkel is out as Germany's leader. A look at the person and the surprising political nemesis who may have helped her achieve her one-time title as the world's most powerful woman.
After the election of Donald Trump in 2016, she was seen as the leader of the free world.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. China has become a growing focus of U.S. scrutiny, whether it's the communist nation's role in the COVID pandemic, its spying on the U.S. and theft of intellectual property, its control of the supply chain, medicine, and rare earth minerals, or its dominance of the computer chip market. Now Scott Thuman reports from South America on China's major power play in America's backyard.
There is a new tune filling the air across Latin America. A little bit of rock and roll, and a lot of this. The rattle and hum of heavy machinery. In Colombia's capital, Bogota, they are digging deep to create the city's first metro system. And doing so in just 5 years' time.
A project this massive, of this scale and size, currently the largest underway in the entire country, goes a long way in a place like Colombia, where they say it'll create about 17,000 jobs.
An economic boost, to be certain, in a country where unemployment hovers around 14%. But take a closer look at those shiny new rail cars, and you'll see who is helping with all that hiring. The train is Chinese, and so are the companies that won the bids on the $4.5 billion deal to build the metro's first line. On a hill overlooking the city, it's the same story. An impressive fleet of electric buses already in service. Again, it is China behind the wheel, winning the bid to supply and maintain them. From transportation to telecommunications, Chinese phones, car dealerships, food delivery. Chinese investment is everywhere here. And a critical injection of cash, according to Ingrid Chavez, executive director of the Colombian Chinese Chamber of Commerce.
I think China has always had interest in our geographical position, in our economic and political stability. So it makes Colombia the point of attraction to China.
China has a lot of money.
Yeah.
What do you think is their motivation?
China wants to come and help and invest here in those, because they know maybe there are not other countries that can do as much as they can do.
Chinese investment, though, isn't altruism. It's part of a plan called the Belt and Road Initiative, spending trillions of dollars across more than 100 nations to expand China's footprint and trade links with the world. While Colombia has yet to join, the majority of Latin American nations have, like Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, and others, leading to new roads, dams, power stations, and ports.
Is it just the tip of the iceberg? Is it just the beginning?
I think, yeah, if they do good, I think there are a lot of opportunities for them like to keep growing here in our country.
Do you have any concerns?
I don't. Really, I don't.
Yeah.
I think if China is doing good things, why not? We have to welcome them.
Between 1990 and 2009, investment from China to all of Latin America was about $7 billion. But since 2005, it has soared to more than $130 billion. And China's gain is America's loss. In the year 2000, the U.S. dominated trade here. Less than 20 years later, China responsible for a staggering switch.
If the United States doesn't take advantage of that opportunity, others will come to the table and eat its lunch.
International relations expert Sergio Guzman says China's state-backed companies can take more risks than their Western counterparts.
I think American companies are looking at many investment opportunities and saying, that's a little risky for me.
And China can be more bold.
Oh, absolutely. They can afford to have a bad quarter. They can afford to have a bad year. Hell, in Venezuela, they've had bad decades, and they're still there. I think America is not necessarily taking advantage of the opportunities that Latin America offers, but also they've sort of taken us for granted in a way.
He says America took its eye off the prize, so to speak, spending money and focusing on the Middle East instead, sparked by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Closer to the U.S., another growing concern at the Panama Canal, that critical artery for trade connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Busy as ever, it has become another strategic target of China's, investing heavily in recent years.
Here in Panama, you can really see it. On one side of the water, you've got the Panamanian port. Directly across and competing with it, the Chinese port. The concern is that the larger presence China has here, the more control it also has.
Chinese companies now manage ports at both ends of the canal. They've also built bridges and rail lines.
There are always these worries that if China has a footprint, it may also eventually have a military footprint, or it may have control over transit. It may have control over communications. Is that a legitimate worry?
I think it's a legitimate worry decades from now. Geopolitically speaking, they're making moves, and they're giving signs of growing importance to Latin America, and the U.S. is not.
One American leader who is already focused on China's moves here is General Laura Richardson, the head of the U.S. Southern Command overseeing Latin America and the Caribbean. Last March, in a briefing before the U.S. Senate, she didn't hold back.
The People's Republic of China, our long-term strategic competitor, continues its relentless march to expand economic, diplomatic, technological, informational, and military influence.
For Richardson and many U.S. senators, the Panama Canal is a particular worry, and where we spotted what appeared to be Chinese naval vessels.
Senator, what I would like to mention are my two greatest concerns strategically, and that's with the Panama Canal, the projects that the Chinese have around the Panama Canal, and that we want to keep free and open for the global economy, but also for our global war plans.
The fear is that perhaps one day China could try to control access to the canal or station military forces locally, as has happened in Africa, where China also started with investments.
So if you're advising Washington, you're saying, now's the time to step up.
Absolutely, step up, but also pay up. Because I think if Latin American countries don't materialize these investments, they're not going to sit and cross their arms and wait for roads to appear. They're not going to wait for infrastructure and telecommunications investments to just materialize out of thin air.
And if China says, hey guys, we'll help.
Absolutely, that's what they're going to do.
The question now, will China's deep pockets and ravenous reach go unmatched, or serve as a wake-up call for America?
So is there something you can point to that the U.S. is doing to recognize and counter this?
Sure. U.S. diplomats, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, have increased trips to Latin America, and there are more offers for financial help and investment. But we heard over and over again from people in Colombia, and keep in mind, it's one of our closest allies in the region, that if the U.S. and Europe don't step up and help these nations progress, China will, and they will choose China. Keep in mind, part of that is because China is often the lowest bidder, which is a critical part of that decision-making process.
So infrastructure they're taking part in, as opposed to we're giving a lot of cash and foreign aid, which is different.
It's a whole process.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Coming up next, a surprising and controversial paycheck for some government scientists. Polls show that public trust in the scientific establishment has suffered immensely in the wake of COVID. That's prompted many to ask questions about conflicts of interest. Today, with the help of a watchdog group, we look at the issue of government scientists collecting royalty payments from pharmaceutical companies for discoveries made while working on your dime.
So our data shows at openthebooks.com that every single year, NIH doles out $32 billion in federal grant making to 56,000 entities. And that basically buys you the entire American healthcare space.
Adam Andrzejewski of the watchdog group Open the Books says the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, accumulates great influence with the power to decide which scientists and projects get all those taxpayer billions.
Buys you a lot of friends, buys you a lot of allies, and there's great incentive to stay on the establishment narratives that NIH disseminates on public health policy.
Andy says there's reason to question who or what is influencing those policies. Under a 1984 law known as Bayh-Dole, government scientists have a unique arrangement. They can collect royalties from pharmaceutical companies for discoveries they make while working for us.
So here's how the third-party royalty complex works. You have a government scientist funded by taxpayers, and they work in a government lab that's also funded by taxpayers. And when they have an invention, they have a special situation. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, then licenses that invention.
An invention meaning a drug or a device?
Yes.
Okay.
Or therapeutic, to the private sector. And the private sector then pays royalties back to NIH. NIH then distributes those royalties on a royalty split schedule back to the scientist.
Details of those royalty payments to government scientists are kept as strictly held secrets. Republican Senator Rand Paul tried to pry some of them loose when questioning Dr. Anthony Fauci, then head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Can you tell me that you have not received a royalty from any entity that you ever oversaw the distribution of money in research grants?
Well, first of all, let's talk about royalties.
That's the question. No, that's the question. Have you ever have you ever received a royalty payment from a company that you later oversaw money going to that company?
You know, I don't know as a fact, but I doubt it.
It's not just about you. Everybody on the vaccine committee, have any of them ever received money from the people who make vaccines? Right. Can you tell me that? Can you tell me if anybody on the vaccine approval committees ever received any money from people who make the vaccines?
Soundbite number one, are you going to let me answer a question? Okay, so let me give you some information. First of all, according to the regulations, people who receive royalties are not required to divulge them, even on their financial statement, according to the Bayh-Dole Act.
And he literally told Congress, more or less, it's none of your business. I don't have to tell you these things, which is pretty surprising because it would seem to be important.
So during the pandemic, I think the American people started to ask the question, just how close is big government to big pharma?
Open the Book sued to try to get some of the hidden answers. That lawsuit unearthed 3,000 pages of royalty payments to NIH scientists from 2010 to 2021. During that time, 2,407 government scientists received $325 million in secretive royalty payments, averaging out to more than $135,000 each. But much is left unknown. NIH redacted or blacked out key details.
We don't know who paid it. We don't know how much each individual scientist received. We can only see their names and count the number of times that each scientist received a payment. And they also redacted the invention, the license number or the patent number.
How does this stand, do you think, to impact the work the government does on behalf of public health? What conflicts arise?
So every single one of those individual third-party royalty payments has the appearance of a conflict of interest.
Take the example of COVID vaccines. Andrzejewski says the first COVID vaccine to get government approval was Pfizer's, which happens to be part of an NIH royalty sharing agreement. Does that mean NIH helped invent the vaccine and then licensed some of the technology to Pfizer?
Yes.
What does that imply?
Right, exactly. That NIH invented certain aspects of the vaccine that was licensed to Pfizer. When they developed it, they have to pay that royalty. And so NIH is receiving tens of millions of dollars from Pfizer on those royalty payments.
What are the outstanding questions to be answered in sort of the big picture, not about the individual scientists, but from a public standpoint?
We need to be able to follow the money. Unelected bureaucrats are running the entire American healthcare complex without any scrutiny. They're basically telling the American people, sit down, shut up, pay up, we'll run things. And that's not how the federal government is supposed to operate.
By the way, Fauci has refused to quantify all of his personal royalty payments, but has implied they are very small. When we return, we're off to Germany for a surprising look at a powerful woman and her dynamic with Donald Trump. When I say the world's most powerful woman, who do you think of? To many, Angela Merkel met that description after she became Germany's first female head of state. And she may have achieved that status in part thanks to her chief nemesis, Donald Trump. That's according to her biographer, who I spoke with in Berlin. The daughter of a pastor, Angela Merkel grew up in communist East Germany. Merkel biographer Ralph Bollman says that upbringing is one reason Merkel felt so strongly about opening Germany to Muslim refugees flooding into Europe in 2015.
And to live in an open society and to make Germany more open was always an important political aim or topic for her.
But 1 million asylum seekers came with a $6.6 billion price tag in 2015 alone. And there was backlash after Islamic extremist refugees launched multiple terrorist attacks in Germany in 2016. Germany quietly closed its doors and ramped up deportations. Someone in London said to me that with Merkel at the helm, she was almost a world leader in addition to being a German leader.
That's true. During her time in office, she became more and more an international leader, and especially after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, she was seen as the leader of the free world. She became only during those 4 years when Donald Trump was in the White House, and she always was seen as the contrary role model to him and the leader of the Free West, the woman who stood for democracy, compromise, moderation.
Bollman says one weakness in Merkel's tenure as chancellor involved energy policy, and something it turns out Trump was right about.
And so it was very, very difficult to make an exit plan from nuclear energy and coal energy at the same time.
But is that what she did? She made a plan to exit from nuclear and coal?
Yeah, but without having a solution how to promote the progress of renewables.
Notably, Merkel's fossil fuel exit plan involved making a deal with Russia to supply fossil fuel and a pipeline to transport gas directly from Russia to Germany, bypassing Ukraine, Nord Stream 2. That drew criticism from then-President Trump, who said the pipeline would give Russian President Putin too much influence over Germany's fate. Trump says he sent Merkel a white flag to make the point.
I told Germany, don't make a deal with Russia on the pipeline. And they said, oh, that's so funny. I actually sent, during a meeting, G7, I sent Angela Merkel, a white flag of surrender.
President Trump put sanctions on the Russian pipeline in December 2019. President Biden lifted the Russian sanctions in 2021 over Ukraine's objection. Then Biden reimposed sanctions last year as Russia prepared to invade Ukraine.
There will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
But Trump's predictions proved prophetic. Germany's reliance on Russia has left Germany facing an energy crisis with skyrocketing prices, shortages, and rationing. Bowman says eventually the German people wanted a future of change and bold new ideas, in contrast to the steady leadership Merkel provided. Her contentious dynamic with Trump will remain a defining characteristic of her final years in office. That makes me think, if Donald Trump had stayed in office, might she have been able to stay in office?
Yes. Well, I thought about this question very often during the last elections in the U.S. But of course, she was very much aware that this would be a risk because to recandidate, it would have been very, very risky. And I think that her chancellorship wouldn't have found to a good end in this case.
Merkel left office in December 2021, Europe's longest-serving elected female head of government at 16 years, just surpassing the time of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Despite of all the international crises, it went well for Germans in an economic sense, but also in another sense of security, and so on. And perhaps at a certain time it will be the good old time for many people in Germany.
Succeeding Merkel is her one-time Vice Chancellor Olaf Scholz of the Social Democratic Party, which says it stands for freedom and social justice. We'll be right back. Coming up next week on Full Measure, an interview with a remarkable woman, a whistleblower who exposed shocking alleged medical abuses of prisoners.
According to the records that were found and released, they were being sterilized without consent.
More on her discovery and the retaliation she says she faced for exposing it next week on Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.